Hi, welcome to Play It Loud. I've posted a few, spoken a bit about live concerts in the 60s, early 70s. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about why things are so different now to when they were then. It's perhaps stating the obvious, but no internet, no mobile phones. You wanted to speak to somebody, you had to use a house phone. They were further than a few miles away, you probably had to write to them. You could get a letter there by the following day, but yeah, no computers. TV, we had 3 channels. Radio 1 had just started. You wanted to hear any music that you liked, you had to buy it, or a friend had to buy it. Or if you were lucky, you heard it on the radio. And you had to be lucky, because if you were into the underground, I'd use the Pink Floyd as an example, if you were into any music that lasted more than 3.5 minutes, the chances of you hearing it on the radio were between not a lot and none at all. As for seeing the bands on TV, well, Ready Steady Go, Thank Your Lucky Stars, later the Old Grey Whistle Test, you got a couple of hours a week at most. No, it was a completely different world. And that world, I'm going to get into rock music. Now, there was no rock music back then. It was all pop music. And I don't subscribe to the view that rock music started with Elvis Presley, Bill Haley. I've heard some blues singers being proposed as the start of rock music before then. No, for me, rock music as we know it today, that started with the Beatles and the Stones, and a lot of others joined on that bandwagon. But before then, no. After them, that's when rock music started. And it started in the UK. It didn't start in America, it didn't start over there. Yes, okay, Beatles and the Stones were both UK bands, but it was picked up. And the difference between the two continents, in America, the big bands over there really kicked off in the mid-60s. Before that, they were all, their pop music was handsome young men singing love stories. When their rock bands came on, they came mostly from a folk music background. The Loving Spoonful, the Byrds, Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, they all started, or the people who played in them started in folk clubs. Over here, our bands came out of art schools or men's working clubs. And they didn't live the high life. They lived in bedsits, or they lived in the back of vans. I once shared a bedsit with a band called Wishbone Ash in Kilburn, Cricklewood. Long time ago, and they were travelling most of the time. But yeah, it was a bit different to what it is now. So I want to go through a couple of albums, a few albums to illustrate the point. Yeah. So let's start with the Americans. If you haven't heard it, you need to. This album introduced people to Bob Dylan. It's got Mr. Tambourine on it. It's the opening number. All I Really Want to Do, with another single that got really big sales in America. And before the Byrds, a lot of people had never heard of Dylan. They might have heard Peter, Paul and Mary doing a cover, but no, it was different and it was new, and nobody had done anything like it quite before. So, an important album, something well worth investigating, which brings me on to Loving Spoonful. I've got a double here. Hums of, what a lovely title for an album, Hums of the Loving Spoonful. And it's fairly obvious where John Sebastian got his background from, lead singer and writer of most of their songs. I'm sure you know their songs. Summer in the City is probably the most famous. I like some of the older stuff that's not so well known. A track called Money, very, very clever. But folk singers came out of folk clubs. That's where they were. Third, Jefferson Aeroplane, Grace Slick, Somebody to Love, White Rabbit. Grace Slick came out of a band which she was in with her brother, I think. And one of the lead tracks on their only album was Sally Go Round the Roses. And Sally Go Round the Roses is a folk song. The Americans came out of folk clubs, listened to the rock music that was coming across to them from the UK and adapted it. And it was different, very different. And to illustrate how different, let's come to the UK, not too far out of time. The Kinks' first album. Kinks' first album, You Really Got Me. It's, what's that? The prototype heavy metal band, the first big rock riff. Yeah, I think nearly everybody knows You've Really Got Me. It's on this album. The album got a lot of covers, got a few tracks. Stop Your Sobbing's on it, covered I think by the Pretenders and by others. It's the beginning of rock music. Ray Davies didn't come out of a folk club. Ray Davies came out of Muswell Hill Working Man's Club, and that's how they got their start. Completely different to what you might have got in America. So we'll move on, and perhaps not their first album, but rock music? Yeah, come on, of course it is. Psychedelic rock music, but Cream's second album, Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker, this was a rock album, not a pop album, but I'm pretty sure that back in the days, a lot of people would have called it that. The first album was very blues, Feel Free, yeah, Spoonful was on it. It was a very blues-based album, mostly with covers, but Disraeli Gears, yeah, okay, psychedelic, but I don't know, it's a rock album. And if we go back even further, The Animals. The Animals were huge in the UK. I think they were later in America. They were the first band to make a single that ran over 3.5 minutes. House of the Rising Sun ran to over 4 minutes, and they were told, you'll never get it played. It won't go on the radio. Nobody will play anything that long. And at the risk of stating the obvious, they were wrong. House of the Rising Sun, I think, got to #1 and stayed there for a while. It got released in America and did exactly the same thing. And the Animals became really, really big. They broke up. Eric Burton went on to a solo career. He played with War in the late 60s. Did a solo career around San Francisco and was still playing, I think, a few years ago. He has that voice. But the point I'm trying to make is it's rock music. It's not pop music. Rock music started with the Beatles and the Stones in the mid-60s and went through from there and grew. Maybe it might move on eventually to Led Zeppelin, Metallica, Tom Petty. There's bands around, Oasis, rock music. So when you're listening to rock music, remember where it came from. And on those albums, play them loud.